Wonderful. So all of us here today have something very much in common. Regardless of what type of business you run, regardless of what region of the world you're from, we all have something that we want to change. For most of us, that's about changing something external, getting a customer to change their opinion about something, turning a prospect into a client, getting people to think differently about a particular industry. But how do we do that? We often push and pressure and cajole and nothing happens. And so the simple question I'm going to ask today is, could there be a better way? Could there be a better way to change minds and drive action, not by pushing, but by doing something else? And so we'll talk about a few different things today. We'll talk about how we can close more deals, how we can change client thinking, and if we can drive success by understanding why people change and why they don't. And so as very nicely mentioned, I'm Professor Jonah Berger. I'm a marketing professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And what I'm going to do today in the short period of time that we have together is give you a brief tour of my recent New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, The Catalyst: How to Change Anyone's Mind. We'll talk about why people change, why they don't, but most importantly, what we can do about it. How by understanding the science of change, we can be more effective in changing minds and driving action, and at the end of the day, becoming more successful entrepreneurs. And so let's dive right in. And I know each of you is on sort of a hero's journey, right? You each have something you want to achieve. You have a business that's already pretty successful, but you want to make it even more successful. How do we do that? But in each of these journeys, in every hero's journey, there's a villain. And the villain today has a name, and that name is the status quo bias. Now, you may not have heard of the status quo bias, or you may, but even if you haven't heard of it before, you can probably kind of guess what it means, right? What the status quo bias means is that any time people are making a choice, they're often making a choice between at least two things. An old thing, what we might call the status quo, and a new thing. Now, anytime people are making that choice, sometimes they pick the old thing. They stick with the status quo, but that by itself isn't a bias, right? That old thing might be better than the new thing. But it turns out that even when the new thing is better, even when the new thing is up to 2.6 times better, people still have a tendency to stick with the old one. That's why it's a bias. And you may not have heard the term status quo bias before, but you've probably experienced the underlying intuition, right? That idea of inertia, that idea if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That idea of we've always done it that way, right? You may be pitching a prospect on something saying, well, I've always worked this particular way. Why do I need to change? And so that status quo bias is fighting you. And there are three key reasons underlying that bias. The first is ease. It's just easier for people to do things the way they've done them before, to buy the same products, to use the same services, to support the same ideas. We've never gone grocery shopping before together, but I bet when you go to the grocery store, you buy the same kind of stuff again and again. You buy exactly the same thing every week, but when you buy milk from the same manufacturer in the same size. When you buy eggs, you buy the same number of eggs from the same company. Why? It's just easier. It requires less work. And so that's the first thing. It's easier to do what we've done before. The second one is equally interesting, and that is attachment. And to talk about a little bit about attachment, I'll tell you about a nice piece of research that was done a few years ago. They looked at people selling homes, and what they found is that the longer people have lived in a home or apartment, the more they value it, even above and beyond market price. And you can say, well, sure enough, hopefully the market goes up over time, but even controlling for that change in the market, the longer someone has lived somewhere, the more they value it. And if we think about why, the answer is really clear. Well, it's not just four walls anymore. It's my four walls. And so I become attached to this place. My memories are attached to it, and it's hard to let it go. And so as a result, I value it more. And so in addition to ease and attachment, right, we're attached to the old way of doing things, the old product, the old service, the old idea, the old way of doing business. But in this that ease and attachment, there's a third piece, which is that old things feel safe and new things feel risky. And what do I mean by that? Well, old things aren't perfect, right? Old things always have problems, but at least we know what the problems are. Maybe someone's worked with a certain service provider or a certain way of doing things before. It's not perfect, but at least they know what the problems are. That new thing, well, it might be better, but it also might be worse. And so is it worth switching? Many people say no. And so those three aspects, the ease, the attachment, and the risk aversion, all underlie the status quo bias. We can think about them almost as the three horsemen of inertia. And so one question is, well, how do we get people to move forward even if so many things are holding us back? And so usually when we think about changing minds and driving action, we think about a particular type of approach. And that's a version of what I'll call pushing. And what do I mean by that? Well, we think if I just send someone one more email, if I make one more phone call, if I give them one more in-person pitch, if I just give them all the reasons why they should work with me, well, they'll be more likely to choose me. We think if we just push a little harder with facts, with figures, with reasons, with information, they will come around. And it's clear why we think that, right? If there's a chair in the middle of a room and we want to get that chair to go, well, pushing is a great way to get it to go. We apply a little force on one side of the chair and then it slides across the floor. And so often we apply the same intuition to people. We think, hey, if we just push people a little bit harder, they will come around. But think about the last time you pushed someone. Or think about the last time someone pushed you. Did you just slide across the floor like that chair? Probably not. Right? If you think about what you did, or the person you tried to change, what they did is they probably did everything but slide across the floor. They dug in their heels. They resisted. They probably thought about all the reasons they didn't want to do what you suggested. Because here's the problem. When we push people, they push back. Right? They don't just sit there. They almost do often the opposite of what they want to do. They dig in their heels. They resist. They become unwilling to change. And so if pushing doesn't work, what does? Well, there's a really nice analogy here to be made to chemistry. Now, I'm not a chemist. I'm not smart enough to be a chemist, but I have some good friends who are, and they talk about how chemical change is really hard. Think about carbon being squeezed together over eons of time into a diamond. Think about plant matter being slowly turned into petroleum over a long time in the ground. Often change takes a lot of time to occur. Now, chemists in the lab, they can't wait that long. So what do? Well, they add temperature, or they add pressure to the system. They squeeze things together, they heat them up. By adding energy, they create change. But there's a special set of substances that make change happen faster and easier. These substances do everything to clean the grime on your contact lenses if you wear contacts, to clean the grime on your car's engine, and multiple Nobel Prizes have been won for innovation in this space. But what's most interesting is the way these substances work. They don't heat things up. They don't squeeze them together. In fact, they allow change to happen with less energy, not more. And very simply, these substances are called catalysts. And when we think about the word catalyst in our sort of social lives, or the way we think about the word, we often say, well, so-and-so was a catalyst, or this thing was a catalyst. What do we mean? We often mean, well, this was the thing that happened right before change occurred. But catalyst actually has a very specific scientific meaning. Catalysts don't just create change. They lower the barriers to change. They identify the obstacles, the barriers that are out there, and they mitigate them. They allow change to happen with less energy, not more. And the same thing is true in our social world. Great social catalysts, great change agents in our social world, they don't sit there and go, well, what could I do to change someone's mind? They say, well, they don't say, why hasn't someone changed, could change someone's mind? They say, well, why hasn't that person changed already? What's stopping them? What are the barriers or obstacles that are getting in the way? And how by mitigating those barriers or obstacles can it make change more likely? It's almost like being parked in a car, if you think about it, right? So imagine you come out of a kid's soccer game with movies and your car is parked on a hill. And so you stick your key in the ignition, you put the key in, and you step your foot on the gas, hoping that the car will go. Well, if the car doesn't go, we think we just need more gas. Right? If that prospect isn't turning into a client, if the client's not approaching things the way we think they should, we think we just need more gas. One more email, one more phone call, one more push to encourage them to change. But just like people in the car, right? If the car's on a hill and the parking brake's up, right? Gas isn't going to make it go anywhere. And the same is true of people, right? We need to be better at identifying or finding the parking brakes, figuring out what those barriers or obstacles are to change, and figuring out how to mitigate them. And in writing this book, I talked to an amazing set of change agents. I talked to top-selling salespeople and transformational leaders. I talked to people who changed a client or a prospect's mind, but I've also talked to more unusual change agents. I've talked to substance abuse counselors. I've talked to hostage negotiators. I've talked to parenting experts, which depending on whether you have a young child at home, you might argue is the most difficult audience to change. Again and again, the same 5 barriers came up. And so I put them in a framework called the REDUCE framework. The R stands for reactance, the E for endowment, the D for distance, the U for uncertainty, and the CE for corroborating evidence. Each of these barriers comes up again and again, whether we're trying to get a prospect on board or get a client to think about something differently, or whether we're trying to get somebody in our own personal lives to approach something differently. Right? The same barriers come up again and again. Too often we know a lot about the outcome we want to achieve and a lot less about the people we're trying to change. But if we understand these barriers and we figure out what the barriers are in our context, we can make any sort of change more likely. Now, unfortunately today I don't have time to talk about all 5 of these in depth, but I picked out a couple that I think are really useful for solopreneurs. We'll talk about reactance, because that's an interesting and easy one to start with, and I'll talk about uncertainty as well. And in each of these, I'll give you some sense of what the science is, what the barrier is, what the science behind it is, and some tactics and approaches to mitigate those barriers. Because my goal is really simple. I want you to walk out of today's conversation with at least 2 or 3, not even 4 or 5 things you can do tomorrow to make change more likely. Okay, so let's dive in. And first, I want to talk about these. Anyone know what these are? Looking at the screen, anyone recognize these? You might sit there going, "Oh yeah, aren't these like laundry pods?" And you're right, they're Tide pods. And not all of you are from the U.S., but for those who are, Tide is a very big detergent brand here. And so let me tell you a little story about Tide pods. So a number of years ago, Tide, owned by Procter & Gamble, wanted to make laundry faster and easier. Now, doing laundry is not that difficult. We've all done laundry before, but there are a few key sticking points. First, we never know exactly how much detergent to add. Second, it's sticky or it's messy, it gets on the counter or our hands. And third, it ends up it would be better if some of the detergent went in early in the cycle and other parts of it went in later in the cycle, but you can't do that with traditional liquid or powder detergent. So Tide spent a bunch of money on R&D, and they come up with these beautiful, colorful squares. Essentially, set it and forget it. So one of these things in the laundry takes care of all the problems we just talked about. They spend over $100 million on marketing, and they hope it can take a big chunk of the over $1 billion laundry industry. So Tide releases Tide Pods, and they come out and they're doing okay, but then they hit a snag, which is that people are eating them. And I want to pause here for just a second. You might be sitting there going, "What do you mean people are eating them? Aren't these things filled with chemicals?" Yes, they are filled with chemicals, and yes, people were eating them. There was a video online where someone said they looked good enough to eat. There was a picture of them melted on top of a pizza, and suddenly, mostly young people, were challenging one another to eat Tide Pods. Now, imagine you're a Tide executive in this situation. You're probably sitting there going, "Well, what should we do?" Right? I mean, people should know not to eat Tide Pods, but just in case, let's put out an announcement. And so they did. They put out a press release saying very simply, "Don't eat Tide Pods." In case that's not enough, they hired a celebrity, this gentleman, Rob Gronkowski, of most recently Tampa Bay Buccaneers fame, to shoot a public service announcement saying, "Should you ever eat Tide Pods? No. What about just for fun? No, 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 no." Okay, so Gronk told people not to do it. Tide told people not to do it. They thought that would be the end of it. Well, let's see what happens. So here's a little data over time. This is searches for the Tide Pod Challenge over time. And what do you see? Well, sort of increasing slowly but surely up until the point where Tide makes their announcement. Now, Tide is hoping their announcement will stem the tide of interest in the Tide Pod Challenge. People stop thinking about it and things will go back to normal. But that's not what happened. In fact, just the opposite. Searches go up over 400%. Visits to Poison Control go up as well. In the next 2 weeks, more people came in with Tide Pod-related issues than had any 2 years prior. Very simply, a warning became a recommendation. Telling people not to do something actually made them more likely to do it. Now, you might be sitting there going, "Look, Professor Berger, this is an interesting example, but what does that have to do with me? I don't work for Tide, right? I'm trying to get people to do something, not to do something." But this is just one example of a much bigger idea, and that is reactance, which is when pushed, whether to do something or not to do something, people often do the exact opposite of what we want them to. And so let's spend a couple minutes talking about what reactance is, and then we'll talk about how we can reduce it. So at the core, people want to be in control of their lives, right? Reactance is about agency and control. What do I mean by that? People want to feel like they are in the driver's seat. Why did I buy a certain product? Why did I use a certain service? Why did I support a given idea or initiative? I did it because I thought it was a good idea. But as soon as you come along, whether you are a service provider, whether you are a marketer, whether you're a salesperson, whether you're an entrepreneur, whatever role you have, whether you're a parent, whether you're a friend, whoever you are, as soon as you come along and say, "Hey, I think we should do this," or "Let me suggest this," now it's no longer clear who's in the driver's seat. Are they in the driver's seat, or are you in the driver's seat? And the more like they feel like you are in the driver's seat, the less interested they are in doing what you suggested. Essentially, people have an ingrained anti-persuasion radar. Something like a missile defense system that scans the environment for incoming persuasion attempts. And when one is detected, people engage in defensive measures to avoid being persuaded. They avoid the message or they ignore it. Right? Think about what happens when an ad comes on, right? On let's say YouTube or something. Usually, you might skip it, right? Think about when a billboard while you're driving by, you ignore it. right? Or even worse, we do exactly what each of us is doing right now. When we listen to someone speak, when we read someone else's writing, we don't just sit there going, yes. We sit there going, yes, but. We counter-argue. We think about all the reasons why what that person is suggesting isn't exactly right. Hey, Professor Berger, this is a really interesting idea, but does it really apply to me? Or, hey, I could see how this part could apply to me, but does it really apply to this other part of what I do? We poke and prod the argument till they come crumbling down. And so if pushing doesn't work, what does? Well, very simply, we need to stop trying to persuade people so much and get them to persuade themselves. We need to stop trying to sell people so much. We need to get them to buy in. We need to allow for agency. We need to give them back some of that sense of freedom and control and put them back in the driver's seat. And you might say, well, that sounds great, but that sounds like magic. So let me give you at least 3 very concrete strategies to do exactly this. And in the book, I think I talk about 4 or 5, but I'll talk about 3 here in the interest of time. The first is painfully simple, and it's called providing a menu. And what do I mean by that? And so providing a menu goes something along the lines of the following. So often, when we're trying to get people to do something, we say, hey, I think you should do X. And let me tell you all the reasons why X is a good idea. It'll benefit you in this way. It'll save you time. It'll save you money. It'll save you effort. These are all the reasons why you should do X. And the listener's sitting there thinking, well, not just yes, but yes, but. Of course, you would suggest this offering. It's your business, right? Of course, I would suggest this particular thing. It's in my best interest, your best interest to do what you're suggesting, but can I actually trust what you're saying? And so what great change agents, what great catalysts often do is they don't just give people one option. They give them multiple. They say, hey, I think you should do X or Y. Which one do you think is better? And notice what that does. It subtly, but importantly, shifts the role of the listener. Because now rather than sitting there and thinking about all the reasons they don't like what you've suggested, instead you've given them a new job. Which of the things you've suggested do they like better? And because they're focused on which one they like better, they're much more likely to pick one at the end of the interaction. It turns the X choice, the yes or no choice, do I want to do this or not? Or if you just flipped a coin, half the time the answer would be no, to a which one choice. Do I prefer X or Y? Right? Not think about all the other options, things I could do instead. And it's called providing a menu because this is exactly what happens when you go out to dinner. They don't just say, here's dinner. And they also don't say, well, we'll make whatever you want. They say, here's a limited set of options, a menu, choose from within that choice set. It's choice, but it's guided choice. Not telling people will do whatever you want, but it's also not forcing them down a particular path. It's giving them choice within some sort of balance. And this is really powerful because it gives them that sense of freedom and autonomy. And you might be sitting there going, okay, Professor Berger, great, I agree, giving people choice, but how many options should I give people? And if you think about that for a second, what would you guys say? How many options would be the right number to give? And many of you would probably say, well, maybe 2, maybe 3, sort of good, better, best, potentially. Either of those is fine. The answer is not 42 or 68 or 112. Not so many options that feel overwhelming. A limited set of options that makes people feel like they can choose. Right? Because that limited set of options will encourage them to focus on the options they have rather than the ones that they don't. Because they can always do something else instead. But by focusing on a couple things that they'd actually consider, they can focus between them. And second, some of you might say, okay, I get it. Look, I've got to give people choice. I'm going to give people 2 options. One that's the thing I want them to do, and the other is a terrible option, something they will never choose. Now, I'll ask you a question. That seems clever in some ways, right? It sort of forces people to do that thing you want them to do. But will that actually work? Think about it for a second and think about, will that actually work? Right? And if you think about it, hopefully what you realize is the answer is no. Not only is it tricky and it doesn't seem authentic and those things, but it defeats the purpose of giving people choice, because if you give them 2 options, one of which they'd never choose, they don't actually have a choice. They only have one option. But if you give people 2 options, at least 2 options that they actually consider, they focus on the difference between those 2 options rather than all the other options they could choose instead. Give people a menu, a good menu that they're actually interested in, and they'll focus on the menu rather than all the other off menu options they could consider. All right, that's the first strategy, painfully simple. Let me give you a second one that's kind of a cousin of the first, and this is called ask, don't tell. And what do I mean by that? Well, when we make statements, people often push back. But when we ask questions, something quite different happens. I was talking to a leader recently who was having trouble motivating a group of people. She was trying to get them on board for something she wanted them to do, and they were kind of pushing back. They weren't interested. And so finally she calls a meeting. She says, look, we all believe in this idea. Do you want to be a good idea or a great idea? And everybody says a great idea. And she says, fantastic. Okay, then how do we get there? How do we turn this into a great idea? And everyone starts talking and making different suggestions and so on, because good questions do three things. First, they deactivate that anti-persuasion layer. Rather than telling people something, making statements which they push back, again, you've given them a different job, sharing their opinion, which people are more than happy to do. There are a few things people like doing more than sharing their opinion. But second, good questions allow you to collect information to help you achieve your goals. Right? Too often, we don't know about all the barriers and obstacles that are in the way. We know a lot about the outcome, but not a lot about the people we're trying to change. But the more we understand why a prospect is wary, the more we understand what a client is worried about, the more we understand why someone's not interested in what we're trying to get them to do, the better we can show them that, hey, either a different offering that we provide would be better for them, or we actually can meet their needs in a different way than they might thought possible. By understanding those barriers, by asking good questions, we better understand them and a better way to create value for our audience. But the last piece here is equally important. That is that good questions encourage commitment to the conclusion. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we ask someone, hey, what do you care about in this particular space? And they say, I care about X, Y, Z. And then you say, fantastic, we're going to do exactly that, or my solution solves exactly that. It's a lot harder for them to say no because it was their idea in the first place. Right? I was talking to someone recently presenting these ideas, and they said, it's so funny. My boss loves feeling like everything is his idea. And I said, the funny thing here is it's not just your boss. Everybody likes feeling like things are their idea. The more we feel like something is our idea, the more attached we become to it, and the more we like it. Right? Everybody loves their own ideas. We all think our own ideas are pretty good. Other people's ideas are more mixed, but our ideas are excellent. Right? Because we become attached to things we have ownership of. And so the key insight here is give away ownership. Right? Allow people to participate in the process or shape the outcome. Right? The more they feel like they've been on board early on, the more they feel like it's not yours, but it's theirs as well. The more they have ownership of it, the more they'll want to see it succeed, and the more they'll support it. The third piece here, third strategy, equally interesting. This is called highlighting a gap. And so I'm going to show you a short video here with an anti-smoking ad from Thailand, and hopefully the sound will work. And so it's not going to be in English. There will be subtitles at the bottom. But check out this video, and then we'll talk about it in just a second. Okay? So here we go. Pretty powerful campaign. So I know I went by a little quickly. Let me mention a few details. So first, hugely successful. 40% increase in calls to the quit line. Videos of the campaign go viral around the web, get millions of views. But what's more interesting than that is why this campaign worked. What made this campaign so successful? And so it's easy to focus on kids. It did use kids. It's easy to focus on emotion, and that is true as well. But something more complex is going on. The Health Promotion Foundation realized they had a problem, which is that if they kept telling people to do something, in this case to quit smoking, and people weren't interested, eventually they would ignore them It's just like you as a solo entrepreneur, right? The more you push your service or offering, eventually people just stop answering your emails, they'll stop answering your phone calls, they won't listen to the possibility of change. And second, they also realize at the Health Promotion Foundation that information is not enough. Too often we think we just give people more information, they will come around. But the Health Promotion Foundation realized actually smokers had lots of information, right? The folks in this video, knew that smoking caused lung cancer and strokes and emphysema, and yet they were still doing it. And so information by itself was unlikely to be enough to get them to change. What would? And so the Health Promotion Foundation realized something deeper about human psychology, which is people like their attitudes and their actions to line up. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I say I care about the environment, I better recycle. If I say I care about a certain sports team, I better watch their games. I want what I say and what I do to match up. But if they don't match up, if there's a misfit between those two things, a negative emotional reaction called cognitive dissonance occurs, and we do work to resolve that dissonance. We do work to make those attitudes and those actions more in line, which is exactly what happened in this case. The Health Promotion Foundation highlighted a gap. They pointed out a gap between attitudes and actions. They said, hey, smoker, you just told that kid not to smoke, but you're smoking. Do you want to do something about it? And notice smokers are stuck, right? They're sitting going, my attitudes and actions aren't aligned, and so I want to bring them in line. What can I do? Well, I can tell the kid to smoke, which I'm not going to do, or I can think about quitting smoking myself, which is what 40% of them did. And the word highlight here is really important because smokers never would have told a kid to smoke if they had never been asked, right? This campaign highlighted a gap, pointed out a case to smokers where they were being inconsistent, and let smokers do the work to resolve that gap. And this is true more broadly, right? I was working with an organization where there was an old project that wasn't working, over budget, was losing money, but someone was attached to it. They didn't want to let it go. And people kept telling them, look, you got to kill this project, but it wasn't working. So finally they asked the person a question and said, hey, someone else is thinking about doing something similar. Based on what you know now, do you think that they should do that similar thing? And the person thought about it and said, no, given what I know now, no, I wouldn't suggest they do something similar. And the original person said, oh, wow, that's really interesting, but then why are we still doing it? And 2 weeks later, that project was shuttered, not because someone told the person to shutter it, because someone else helped them realize that it wasn't necessarily a good idea. That person highlighted the gap between attitudes and actions, right? Encouraging people themselves to close it. Now, the one thing I will say here, though, is sometimes we hear this and go, okay, great, I got it. I need to tell people they're inconsistent. I need to tell someone they're being a hypocrite. Is that the idea? And the answer very clearly, I think, is no. Right? Nobody likes being told that they're a hypocrite, that they're inconsistent. I don't know about you, but if you have a friend and you tell them, hey, you're being inconsistent, they don't just sit there going, oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate you telling me I'm being inconsistent. That's just say, screw you. Nobody wants to be told they're being inconsistent, but by helping them realize themselves that they're inconsistent, they will do the work to bring those two things in line and change as a result. All right. I've spent some time talking about reactance and how to do it. How to reduce reactance. E is for endowment. I'm not going to spend time there. D is for distance. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to spend a couple minutes on uncertainty, and then I'll wrap up and hopefully have time for at least a couple questions. And so anytime we're getting people to change, there is often uncertainty. And in particular, there's often uncertainty around something that is called switching costs. And so if you think about it, any time we make a change, we buy a new product, we use a new service, we work with a new provider, whatever it might be, there are often costs of making that change. Let me pick something really simple. Let's say I want to buy a new lawnmower, right? That costs some money. My old lawnmower, I've currently paid it off. My new lawnmower, I have to pay to buy it, right? So there's a cost of that change. Let's say that I buy, a new type of car, maybe an electric vehicle, for example. Well, it's not only the cost of buying that car, there's also the time and effort of learning how to use it, right? I have to figure out how do I plug it in and how many miles am I going to need and various sorts of different things. And so it's not just monetary costs, but also time and energy costs. And I think often we focus on the monetary costs, particularly if we're saving someone. We say, look, all this money we're saving you, you should make the switch. And people often say, going, well, hold on, it's not just money. Right? I have to implement a new software system, if I have to do something different, if I have to upload all my things in a different place, all that's work, all that requires effort, and that makes people less interested in switching, right? It requires them to learn something new, which often is costly. And so these costs of change discourage people from taking action. We often focus on the benefits. Look at all the upsides you can get with my new offering, but people are sitting there thinking about the cost. What's it going to cost me to make that change? But it's even more complicated. Because if you think about it, which is first? The cost of change or the benefits of change? Right? The cost of that new offering or the benefits of that new offering? If you think about it, the costs are almost always first. You have to pay for the product. You have to sign up for the service. You have to import your information or do something different to learn how to use something new. The costs, most of them are often up front, while the benefits are later. And let me tell you something else. If you think about which there's more certainty around, cost or the benefits, there's often more certainty around the cost. I know it'll cost at least this much to do this, while the benefits are relatively uncertain. And so costs are now, benefits are later, costs are certain, benefits are uncertain. No wonder people don't want to change. This is called the cost-benefit timing gap. Right? It's not just that there are costs and people want the benefits, but the challenge is the timing of those costs and the uncertainty around the benefits is leading people not to take action. It's almost like telling people, look, you're on one side of the mountain, and on the other side of the mountain is the promised land. You know, you hike up all that mountain, deal with all the difficult things of making it up the mountain, and down the other side, and things will be better on the other side. And the person sitting there going, well, I hear that's what you're saying, but the mountain looks like it's pretty big to climb. Do I want to go all the way up that mountain only to find that the other side isn't much better for me than where I am at the moment? No thanks, I'm just going to stay put. Okay? And let me tell you, though, it gets even worse. Because there was a study that was done at Stanford University a number of years ago, a very simple study, where they asked students to imagine that they had just taken a tough test at the end of a semester. They felt tired and run down, but congratulations, they passed. And they have an opportunity to buy a very attractive 5-day Hawaii vacation package at a really low price, but the offer expires tomorrow. And they're asked, do you want to buy the package, not buy the package, or decide later? And the students thought about it. And they said, well, look, you know, I just took this tough exam. I passed. I'm feeling pretty good about myself. I'm going to buy this vacation package. That makes a lot of sense. There was a second group of students, though. Everything else was the same, but one key detail different. They failed the exam. Now, the students are faced with the same choice, and those students actually made the same choice. Even though they failed, they said, look, I feel tired and run down. I've got to take the exam next semester anyway. I can't take it tomorrow to retake. I got to study somewhere. I'm going to buy that vacation package. I'm going to go to Hawaii. I'm going to study. I'm going to rest and recuperate, feel better, come back and take the exam. Okay, so if you pass the exam, you want to buy the vacation package. Fail the exam, you buy the vacation package. But there's actually a third group. Everything is identical, exactly the same, except one key detail. There's uncertainty. You will find out tomorrow whether you passed or you failed. Do you want to buy the package, not buy the package, or decide later? Now, these individuals that were uncertain are sitting there with an interesting situation, right? There's some uncertainty there. And so any of you who have a background in economics, in finance, in decision analysis, and logic, or even mildly paying attention, you know what people should do. They are at a decision point. If they pass, if they end up passing, what will they want to do? Well, they want to buy the vacation package. And if they end up failing, what will they want to do? Buy the vacation package. And so even though they don't know which path, right, whether that the inflection point, which path they're going down, they should still buy the vacation package. What do you think they actually did? Right? And if you think about it, what they actually did is they decided later. Or essentially they hit the pause button. Anytime people don't know what to do, they say, you know what, I'll do nothing. I'll hit the pause button. I'll stay here, right, and sit tight till that uncertainty resolves, if it ever does. And so a key question is, how do we get people to unpause? How do we get them to move past whatever that uncertainty is that they're feeling? Because it's not just us convincing them that our offering is good. It's that uncertainty of change. They're already doing something. They're already working with someone. They're already using something. There's an option they already have that's out there, and we're saying they should switch to us, and they're sitting there going, I don't know. Is it going to be worth it? I'm uncertain. Maybe I'll just sit tight. So how do we get them to unpause? Well, there's an interesting example from a company many of us know, which is Dropbox. And if you think about it today, Dropbox is a unicorn, billion-dollar business, but initially they had a lot of trouble getting off the ground. Why? Well, very simply, people were uncertain. They were used to storing their files on their desktop. They didn't know anything about cloud storage. This company was telling them that cloud storage would be better, and they were sitting there going, I don't know. I don't want to lose my files. That would be pretty bad. I'm just going to sit tight. And so Dropbox thought about spending a bunch of money on advertising. They thought about buying a bunch of Google keywords, but they realized it wouldn't solve the fundamental issue, which is people were uncertain. And so they did something different. They gave their product away for free, their service away for free. They gave anyone who's interested up to 2 gigabytes of storage absolutely free. And you might say, well, how do you build a billion-dollar business giving away things for free? But they didn't just give away something for free. They harnessed a principle that many of us know as freemium. Right? Yes, there's a free version of Dropbox, but there's also a paid version that you can upgrade to if you want. And you may have not heard the word freemium before, but you've certainly experienced the idea of freemium. if you use Pandora, if you used to use Skype, if you use Zoom, if you subscribe to the New York Times, if you use Dropbox, Evernote, almost every software as a service has a freemium model, right? There's an entry-level option with either some of the features or limited storage, for example, for free, and you can upgrade to a premium version. On music listening services, for example, there's a free version with ads, and you can pay to get rid of those ads. And sure, companies people like freemium because they like free things, but companies like them as well. And the reason why is that it makes people more comfortable trying something. Because Dropbox can say, look, we're great. And someone say, but how do I know that you're great? Right? Of course, you would say you're great. How do I know? But freemium, giving them something that allows them to try it, makes them more likely to try it, which makes them more likely to buy it because it makes it easier for them to experience the value of the offering. Sure, you say Dropbox is good, but if I use it and I'm storing all my stuff, I'm going to be happy to upgrade to the paid version because I found the value myself. Now, I love freemium. There's a whole chapter in the back of the book, an appendix chapter about how to apply it. It's a great and useful tool. But some of you might say, look, I get how you apply freemium to a software as a service model, but what if you have a physical offering? Or what if you have a different type of service, not a software service, but what if I'm a lawyer? What does freemium look like if I'm a lawyer? I'm an accountant or something along those lines. And it turns out, though, that the principle is actually not about freemium. Freemium is just one example of a much bigger idea. And so let me tell you about that idea. So imagine you're interested in buying a new car. And so you go to the car dealership and you say, hey, I'm interested in this new car. If they said, okay, it costs you, give me $50,000 and I'll let you check out this new car, you'd say, well, no, I'm not going to pay you all that money before I know that I like the car. And so what do car dealerships do to solve this problem? Well, they do something very simple. They do test drives. Now, test drives aren't freemium. There's no free version of the car or premium upgrade version. It's just a test drive. But test drives, whether at the car lot or the Apple Store, do the same thing that freemium does. They lower the barrier to trial. They make it easier for people to experience the value of your offering. And if they like that offering, they're more willing to do whatever's next to take that action. The same is true with free shipping, right? Enabling online commerce. The same is true with free samples at the grocery store, encouraging us to buy something new. The same is renting rather than buying. Right? If you couldn't rent skis before you ever went skiing, no one would learn how to ski. Right? Renting skis is not that expensive, but buying them is really expensive. Renting them allows you to experience it, figure out whether you like it, and if you like it, you'll pay the money to buy the thing as well. All these examples lower the barrier to trial. They take some of those upfront costs and they push them to later, and they take some of those later benefits and they bring them to sooner. They reduce the uncertainty by giving people experience of the value that you're offering. And you might say, well, this is great. I get how it works for products. I get even how it works for services. But what about ideas? Could we apply this thing to ideas as well? And it turns out that you can. And so there's a great example that I think does a really nice job of this. There was a city in Central America that had a big pollution problem. Too many cars on the road, lots of gridlock, lots of pollution. And so they put in a bunch of bike lanes and a bunch of bus lanes, and they're hoping that this will reduce the problem. And so a few weeks in, there's some success. Many people are taking the buses. That's good. Traffic is less than it was before, but the bike lanes are completely empty. And so the city does a little work. They call up some consumers. They look, why aren't you biking to work? And these individuals say, well, look, the buses are driving really close to the bike lane, and that makes me uncomfortable, and so I'm not going to bike to work. And so the city goes, okay, this is easy. They call up the bus company and say, look, you got to tell your drivers to move over. The bus company says no problem. They tell their drivers to move over, and everyone hopes that will be the end of it. Well, a couple weeks later, unfortunately, not much has changed. Bus lanes are pretty full. Lots of people are taking the bus. Bike lanes are pretty empty. So the city calls up the bus company and says, look, you got to get your drivers to move over. So the bus company says, okay, so we have a big meeting. They tell the drivers, look, we're going to give rewards. We're going to give some bonuses to people that move over. We're going to punish people that don't move over. Everyone says, okay, we'll move over. Weeks go by. Nothing's happening. And so the company's trying to figure out what to do. And one executive has an interesting idea. It turns out that a bunch of the drivers sit in the parking lot together to have lunch. And there's a small gym that's available to them to exercise while they're sort of having their lunch break. And so this guy has an initiative. He takes an exercise bike from the gym. He puts it in the middle of the parking lot. And he asks his drivers to ride along the bike for just a couple minutes. And while the drivers are riding that bike, he drives the bus really close by them. Let's watch what that looks like. Okay, here it is again. So the next time those drivers are on the road, you think they're going to move over maybe just a little bit? Probably, right? Not because someone told them they had to, not because someone tried to convince them of the value of moving over, but because someone built a flight simulator, right? Essentially, in this case, an exercise bike, a way for them to experience why they should change, right? A way to get a sense of why it was a good idea to do what that person was suggesting, right? Often we want to get people to do something new. Often it's complicated for them to understand why they should do that thing. We can tell them till we're blue in the face, but it's almost more effective to show them, to give them experience. Think about a flight simulator. A flight simulator does is it's not exactly what flying is like, but it's a sense of what flying is like, so people have a better sense themselves of what it's like, even if they haven't done it before. Same thing here, right? Sometimes changing someone's mind is as simple as pulling out an old exercise bike and getting someone to sit on it. All right, let me wrap up here just a couple minutes, and then I'd love to take some questions if there's time. As I talked about today, catalysts reduce roadblocks. And what do I mean by that? Well, we started by talking about how they reduce reactance. They give people choice, right? They highlight a gap between attitudes and actions. They make questions rather than statements. They do all that to give people freedom and autonomy, put them back in the driver's seat, and use that to reduce reactance. We didn't talk about the E, endowment, but the idea there is doing nothing often feels safe. People feel like whatever they were doing previously is safe, whereas new things are risky. We have to show them that doing nothing isn't as safe as they might think. Right? It's almost like you're in a boat in the middle of the ocean, and there's a very small leak in the bottom of your boat. And someone's sitting there going, look, we should all swim to shore. And you might say, what do you mean swim to shore? Shore is really far away. I don't know if we can make it. There might be sharks. No thanks. I want to change. I'll stay in the boat. But here's the problem. That leak is small. And so you might say, look, it's just a small leak. It's not a big deal. But if nothing changes, that boat is eventually going to be at the bottom of the ocean. And so while doing nothing, staying in the boat seems safer than swimming to shore. Often doing nothing isn't as safe as people might think. The D is for distance. When we ask for too much, people ignore us. When what we're asking to do is too far from where they are currently, it's too difficult for them to change, and so they skip it. And so we need to take big change, break it down in smaller, more manageable chunks, ask for less, and only ask, then ask for more. Uncertainty, it's all about lowering that barrier to trial. Right? Helping people experience the value of what we're offering, to encourage them to understand why they should do it, which will encourage them to change. And last but not least is corroborating evidence. Sometimes the best salespeople are not us for our own ideas and services, it's others. Using our existing customers, multiple sources of proof to change minds and drive action. Just two key next steps from this talk, and then I'll wrap up. I know you have a great slate of things to hear about today. Two key next steps in this particular presentation. First, let's get better at finding the parking brakes. I talked about 5 today. You might say, well, what I'm working on, there's a 6th or a 7th. No problem. Let's start by identifying them. In every situation, there are breaks, right? When you go to the doctor's office, the doctor doesn't start by saying, let me put a cast on your leg. The doctor starts by saying, well, let me understand the problem. And only once I understand the problem do I prescribe a solution. We've got to understand the people we're trying to change and those breaks or barriers getting in the way before we can change them. And then second, once we've figured out what those breaks are, we can figure out how to mitigate them. And in case it's useful, there's an application guide on my website, just myname.com/resources, that you can download and work on with your teams. Because good news, it's not random, it's not luck, and it's not chance. There's a science behind why people change and why they don't. If we understand that science, we can be more effective entrepreneurs, we can be better salespeople for our own products, services, and ideas, and at the core, we can change anything. So thank you guys so much. I hope this is a good, at least brief introduction to these ideas. And if there's time, I'd love to take any and all questions. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
Jonah, thank you so much. I can tell just by the energy in the chat that you provided a ton of value today.
Okay.
And I will also put a plug in that I'm halfway through Magic Words. I'm a communications person and have already recommended it to my communications community.
Wonderful. Glad you enjoyed it.
Rest of the chat too. Okay, we know we have a stop in about 5 minutes, so let me jump in on some questions.
Wonderful.
Is there any data that addresses the effectiveness of these tactics when used by men or women? Do the results differ based on the gender of the deliverer or the audience?
Interesting question. Yeah. And so I want to be a little bit careful here because with almost anything, there are some individual differences. Right? So someone might say, well, maybe men are more stubborn, right? And so men have more reactance than women, for example. Or you could also say culturally, right? Maybe individuals in certain cultural contexts have more reactance. Maybe older people have more reactance than younger people, or vice versa. And while there may be some small differences in some of these things, often those differences are swamped by the variation, right? So even if it were true that men are a little bit more, let's say, reactant than women, I'm not sure that's true, but even if it were true, I think we all know women who are quite reactant, and we all know some men who are not as reactant. Even if it was the case that, maybe people are more wary when one gender is pushy than another, I think there are cases when we're wary of either gender is pushy. And so I would think less about sort of differences in particular about the communicator and more about what situation am I in, who is my audience, and what are their barriers, right? What do they care a lot about? What are their challenges? And how by understanding them can I make things more likely to work change-wise. You mentioned my most recent book, Magic Words. I talk in there about the language of certainty and confidence. And there is some research showing, hey, women often ask, men react negatively when women use very confident language. And I think sometimes that is certainly true. I think some of that also has to do with the situation we find ourselves in, right? So I don't think it's just gender, though sometimes it is gender, but sometimes it's also age, right? Particularly if you're talking to an older man and you are a younger woman, that older man may be very set in his ways and unwilling to change, and may think, how can you, young person, tell me something new? That's not to say old women don't want to change either, but maybe it's particularly pronounced for men. So I think the more we understand the situation we're in and the people we're trying to change, the more effective we can be in getting them to do it.
Great. Here's a good one, I think, for a lot of the solos in the audience that are talking to clients and trying to get them to act. Could you give an example of how we can get clients to see why change is imperative? I'm thinking of it how to get them to see what would happen if they did not act.
Yes.
How do you do this?
Yeah, and so I would talk about this highlighting the cost of inaction. And there's a whole section on that in the Endowment chapter of the book. And so I'll give you an example. So I was talking to a sort of financial service / wealth management person. I was talking about the challenge of getting people to do wills or any sort of long-term planning. Right? So people often say, well, I don't need a will. I don't need to do long-term planning. I'm not going to die anytime soon. And I can always go ask my spouse for whatever I need. If accounts are in their name, if accounts are in my name, clients often say there's no need to do this. And so the person had an interesting idea. They say, I would bring a couple into my office, and I would say, guys, unfortunately, I want you to imagine something terrible has happened. And he points at one of the two of them and say, unfortunately, your spouse has died. You're the only one left. How would you solve this particular thing? How would you deal with this aspect that you now need to deal with? And the person would usually go, oh, well, I would just ask my spouse. And the person goes, no, your spouse is no longer here. You can't ask your spouse. How are you going to solve this? And so what that made the person realize is, hold on, by doing nothing, by not getting that will or doing that long-term planning, I'm going to be stuck. Not because someone told them that, but someone helped them realize that doing nothing wasn't as safe as they might have thought, right? It's essentially a flight simulator. Again, that idea with the exercise bike of putting them through an experience that helps them realize it. And so I think the goal, again, very similar to that analogy of the boat with the small hole in the bottom, help people realize that it's not safe, as safe as they might think, to do nothing. Maybe the hole in the boat's only small. Maybe where they are isn't terrible at the moment, but even if it isn't terrible, eventually there's going to be a problem. And by highlighting those costs of inaction, you can make people more willing to take action in the first place.
So good. Okay, we'll take one last question. You talked about how we might not know the barriers and ask good questions. Any suggestions of what you do, of when you do that, and the person then adds conflicting barriers and how to pivot the discussion?
Interesting. So they themselves say conflicting things.
Yes.
Yeah. And
like arguing with my husband.
For example, you will find, by the way, that many of these ideas are also useful in personal life in addition to work life. I think, and this I think is true in many aspects of life, I think the more we can have open and real conversations with people and ask them what they care about the most and show them that you want to help them, right? Just as you might to a spouse or a friend, say, look, what I want to do here is understand what you need. I want to help you. I want to give you what you need, but to do that, I need to understand what you care about. And so, you said A, but I also heard you say B, and I'm not really sure what to do here. Which would you prefer I do? Not saying, oh, you're being inconsistent or these conflicted, but saying, maybe I'm misunderstanding, right? I want to make sure I understood you. I think the word you, by the way, can sometimes feel accusatory, and so we need to be really careful about saying, well, you're not making sense, or you're saying conflicting things. I think the more we can put the onus on ourselves and be like, I want to make sure I understood what was said, so I make sure I can be best be helpful. I think those are situations where people really feel like we want to work with them. They're interested we're interested in listening, and as a result, they're more interested in working.
Amazing. Jonah, what an incredible hour you just gave us. You proved the power of change just by changing the vibes after our rough start. So I thank you for that. I thank you for sticking with us as well as everyone else. For the rest of the day, recordings will be available. We've got an incredible lineup. You guys will see me for the rest of the day over in the build track, and you can find Jonah and his books at his website, and I'm sure any place that books are sold. So thanks everybody. Great start. Everybody again soon.
Awesome.